Now we're going to dive into some of the most pressing legal questions that we're all currently facing as city leaders. Moderating today's discussion, I'm honored to introduce another set of firsts. Carolyn Coleman, the Executive Director and CEO of the League of California Cities. Is California in the house? Let's welcome Carolyn and our panelists to the stage.
Wow, was that a panel? Let me try it again. Wow, was that a panel? Much, much better. Good morning, Washington, D.C. And we deliver the cities. We deliver each and every day. I am Carolyn Coleman. Besides being the executive director, the proud executive director of the League of California Cities, I also chair the National League of Cities Legal Advisory Committee, which makes recommendations on cases, legal cases, for NLC to get involved in. And it's my privilege today to be able to moderate what I think is going to be a pretty consequential conversation, not only at this conference, but also something for you, some practical tips for you to take when you head back home. We all know that the second Trump administration has moved very, very quickly, reshaping the funding relationships, the federal funding relationships between the federal government and our local cities and towns. And frankly, they did it so quickly that many of us, and certainly many of our cities, didn't see this coming. But today's panelists, they're on the front lines of that reality every day, supporting our cities. And we're gonna dive into a little bit about what it all means for our cities. And I'm going to start with Amanda Keller, who is the Executive Director of the International Municipal Lawyers Association. And I'm going to ask Amanda to start us at a high level, let's say the 30,000-foot level, for a little bit of stage setting. Amanda, local governments are obviously navigating a vastly new relationship and a different landscape with the federal government when it comes to federal funding. With agency-level actions, with notices out of the blue of grant terminations, new conditions being put up on grants once you've already received them. What should every city official in this room understand about the new landscape?
Well, thanks, Carolyn. It's wonderful to be back here. Welcome, everybody. So when I think about the biggest challenges that cities are facing when it comes to federal funding, I'd really put these into three major categories. The first is budget uncertainty and risk. The second is conditions on grants that are impacting local policy preferences and local autonomy. And the third is compliance risks, such as subrecipient monitoring. So starting with budget uncertainty and risk, it used to be that federal funding was considered a very stable source of funding. You'd plug it in your budget and you'd forget about it, right? That's really not been the case for many communities in this last year. And we've seen that uncertainty creep in throughout the entire life cycle of the grant. So everything from the original amount in your NOFO changing to when it's actually awarded. We saw that with counterterrorism funding for a number of cities that were designated sanctuary jurisdictions by the federal government. We've seen grants canceled that you alluded to. A lot of grants under the IRA and IIJA, a lot of these were environmentally focused, so things like your Rails to Trails projects, perhaps you're trying to enhance your tree canopy. Those grants were largely canceled. We've seen pauses in federal funding, which creates budget uncertainty, because are you going to get that money or not? We've seen that recently with $300 million in FEMA funding, and when you have shovels in the ground and contractors that are waiting to get paid, that pause can be quite challenging. And in an extreme case, we saw an actual clawback of federal funding, where the Treasury Department went into New York City's bank account and took back money that it had paid New York City for the Shelter Services Program grant. And then the last funding uncertainty piece I would flag is just at the end of the grant, you can always get audited. Now, this has always been the case, but I would just flag that here because at the end of your grant, there could be potential financial penalties or repayment obligations if you are not complying with the terms of the grant. So second big picture item I want to flag, you mentioned the conditions on grants. To me, this goes directly to local policy choices, local preferences. And here we have situations where, let's take immigration and DEI. For some communities, this, that may be aligned with the federal government on those issues, those conditions aren't going to present a problem. But if you're not aligned with the federal government on those conditions and those policies, then the conditions on the grant all of a sudden become a real challenge for you when you are elected to enact particular policies that are now contradicting those conditions and making it challenging to assert your sovereignty and your local autonomy in those spheres. The other issue with conditions that we see is a little bit of vagueness, right? What does it mean to operate an illegal DEI program? Hopefully all of your city attorneys, like Mary here, have vetted your DEI programs if you have them in place, and they have determined that they are lawful under federal, state, and local laws. So you could just certify compliance and say, we don't operate any unlawful DEI. The problem is we don't know exactly what the federal government means when it's saying, you don't operate any illegal DEI programs, and there's potential False Claims Act liability, which increases the risk of damages up to potentially treble damages. And then the last challenge I mentioned, subrecipient monitoring I want to flag here, because you guys get this money from the federal government, and then a lot of times we're passing it along, right? We're passing it along to nonprofits, community partners, et cetera. But your obligations don't stop there. You have to ensure that your subrecipients are complying with the terms and conditions of the grant. This can be challenging, at any time, but right now, for example, with immigration conditions and grants, a lot of subrecipients don't have the ability to use saved verification, for example. So hopefully you have policies and procedures in place to ensure subrecipient monitoring.
In other words, it's complicated.
A true lawyer answer, right?
And certainly it's generated a lot of uncertainty. So that sets the stage a little bit. And so now we're going to zoom in a little bit and take a closer look to what's happening actually on the ground. And it's great to have Mary here, Corporation Counsel for the incredible city of Chicago. We know, Mary, you're one of the largest cities in the country, and certainly one of the most visible in this fight. Can you tell us a little bit about what it actually looks like on the ground, and how is the city of Chicago thinking about potential changes and disruptions in services and operations?
Sure. Mary Richardson-Lowry. I am the Chief Legal Officer for the City of Chicago, while I sit here, I do not stand alone. Our obligation to begin to assess the impact was clear upon not preceding entry of the new administration. What I oftentimes tell my lawyers, I have 248 internal, I hire an additional 250. So I function like a very large law firm. But I had to prepare them for what is coming. And that means not only putting lawyers at the table for every city, I think you will appreciate this, but you put somebody who is operationalized at the table, you put your budget person at the table, you put policy at the table. Lawyers inform outcome. We don't set policy, but we can direct where it goes. In moments like these, it is the lawyers and the judges, from my perspective, that are holding the line. People oftentimes ask about how we approach it. We did it without fear. So I gathered my core teams, comprised of the kind of people roles that I've just articulated. I align myself across the country with people who are also confront issues. Other cities that are large or mid-sized, so that we would talk about impact. At the end of the day, sometimes with lawyers, you think you can function in isolation, but everything I do touches a person. I've been in government in some form or another for over 40 years and serve probably gosh, the last 5 mayors in some capacity or other. No matter where I go, they call me back. I was in Arizona at the time, and I was called back. But I am delighted to serve at this moment because I ask myself, if not you, then who? So for each of my colleagues around the country, I see you, I hear you, we enjoy each other's, the way we move in this space, in the sense of enjoyment has a quote around it because we have to work together to get on the other side. So what are cities doing in this moment, just grounded, that core group I talked about? I have 21 divisions within the law department serving every possible area from a constitutional swing. I have filed over 60 actions. Now, I'm aware that many of the smaller cities can't do that, but I also am aware if you band together, there are extraordinary things that you can accomplish. Let me give you an example of an accomplishment. Amanda referenced it, and this is associated with securing our cities. There are 13 cities across the nation who are a part of a legislation. Securing our cities is about terrorism dollars. The administration, federal administration, decided to hold said dollars. Was I to go quietly in the night? Hardly. So in that moment, I called upon the 12 other cities, and we filed an action. What does that mean, terrorism dollars? That means there are police officers I can't hire, firemen I can't hire, firemen I can't train, nuclear equipment, detection equipment I didn't have access to. Other terrorism, shall I say, imperatives that I would not have been able to ensure were provided on behalf of the city of Chicago. So when I went to Mayor Brandon Johnson, I let him know that those grants dollars were being challenged. He said, Mary, do what you do. And we did. So we challenged it. And my experience has been, upon challenge, either there's a retreat right away or a movement to rejoin. Either way, I'm fine. We'll deal with it. And we did. What that meant is there are citizens that are able to move through not only Chicago, but those other 12 cities today and know that there are terrorism protections that are in place that someone tried to hold back from us. What we are doing as cities, as lawyers, are impacting citizens in such a tangible way. I wanted to share that with you because the first reaction of my staff was they were incredulous that someone would attempt to do that. But there are lots of those kinds of attempts, and each one we have had to overcome. If it's health, if it's housing, if it's mental health, if it's infrastructure dollars. These are grants that attach itself to communities, to people, to imperatives, to life. And I have the pleasure of as the city's chief legal officer on behalf of Mayor Johnson of ensuring that legally nothing gets in our way. And that's where I focus my attention.
Mary's not going away at night. Not worried about that. Good for you, Mary. Thank you for that response. Amanda, when a city does get that notice in the mail from the federal government that a grant is going to be rescinded or new conditions are going to apply, what should the city attorney and the elected officials be thinking about as they consider a response?
Yeah, I know, a lot of folks in this room are not attorneys, but hopefully you have a Mary in your office that can help you through some of these questions. But, really just at a high level, we're thinking about things like the 10th Amendment and our notion of dual sovereignty in this country. And we know that federal law reigns supreme, right? The Supremacy Clause is going to preempt any state or local government laws or policies that are in conflict with federal law. But the 10th Amendment says that the federal government cannot come in and command or conscript your local government, your city employees. And we know that from a Supreme Court case called Prince versus the United States. It was an important case involving the Brady Handgun Protection Act, where Congress tried to say that local police officers should conduct background checks on the prospective purchasers of firearms. So that through line comes through to, let's say, the immigration context, and this is why a lot of cities feel comfortable challenging those immigration conditions. Now, obviously, there are cities on the other side that are free to accept those, and the 10th Amendment has room for both of those. But the issue here is for the cities that have different policies in the immigration context. For example, the 10th Amendment would say the federal government cannot command your employees to help enforce immigration laws. Neither can you interfere with federal immigration laws, but that 10th Amendment is what protects local governments in that context. The other big picture idea here, the spending clause. So we know it's Congress's power of the purse, putting that aside because it's the executive branch putting these conditions on. Congress's power to put conditions on grants is not unlimited. There has to be a nexus, a connection between the condition and the funding. The funding can't be so much money that it amounts to compulsion. When they tried to put all transportation funding on the line in order for you to either comply with immigration or DEI conditions, that's going to be an example of it being too much money under the spending clause. You also have wonky things like the Administrative Procedure Act that we don't need to get into here, but hopefully the lawyers in your office will be able to identify all of those. And if you have a grant rescinded, you'll have different legal avenues to pursue. I will just mention that the Supreme Court has weighed in on a couple of these issues that has made things more challenging. So, Mary mentioned banding together with coalitions. Because of the Trump versus Casa case, you can't just rely on the city of Chicago to sue and then get a nationwide injunction anymore. Now, local governments that have problems with conditions and grants or grants that have been terminated have to join a lawsuit themselves. There are many coalitions. I know Chicago is a leader here, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Amanda. Mary, you talked a little bit about the table that you all might set in the city of Chicago for a decision to be made in terms of how do you respond to one of these notices. Can you walk us through who all is sitting at that table and maybe give us an example, a live example of one?
Sure. First, I'd love to be able to say there's a singular table. There is not. But dominantly, you certainly want to have whomever is in leadership from a mayor's standpoint, he or she will have a person that has a intergovernmental sort of lens to them. I have 50 city council members in Chicago. In addition to the mayor, I have 40 some odd city departments, and there's a budget department. So the budget department is always present. An operational department is important, but it has to be an informed thinker. Honestly, I've seen lots of operational folks come and go, and the wrong person at the table can be deadly under those circumstances. So you want to make sure somebody, if it's an infrastructure series of considerations around grants, you want to make sure you have the right person there. If it's police, you want to make sure you have the right person. Fire, you want to make sure you have the right person. General emergency services, we have what we call an OEMC, which I had the pleasure of negotiating on behalf of the city about 25 or 30 years ago. That is our emergency services. So you want to make sure you have that right person at the table. You also want to make sure you keep a line of sight into the business community. Every city will have voices and organizations within those communities, and they need to be informed. So I will personally meet with some of those so they know where we're going. I don't like them being caught off guard. I know what it's like because many of them, when I was in the private sector at a large firm, were my client base. I want them to know where we're headed and why it matters. So putting them at the table, having a press person come in and out on occasion. I know for many cities it's a bit annoying, but they communicate to various sectors, and having them involved also matters, but on a controlled basis, because obviously in those sessions you don't want everything you're discussing to be broadcasted, but you want to have those control groups. And then so that's one broad control group. There are subsets of small control group around litigation, affirmative litigation, subsets around constitutional imperatives, subsets around public safety, subsets around debt and collections and doing budget notifications. So I keep a chart of every EO that's passed out on the executive side. I know some of you might have some challenges there, but what we do with that is it just informs our thinking. Some things we'll support, some things we know we'll have an issue with, some things we know that we need to change our posture or perhaps pull in an operational department so they know what to do. We'll have a separate session, again, around just public safety, a separate group around infrastructure. And then I'll assign lawyers to participate in all those groups so they're well informed. And then we go out and those things are communicated again to the public. So each of the groups have an informed existence. We also have across our state, I will meet regularly with my counterpart, whether it's Attorney General, State's Attorney's Office, Chief Lawyer in the Governor's Office, and create a line of communication so that as things evolve or devolve, we have a way of communicating with each other and knowing where each other stands, because sometimes everyone's not aligned, but it's important that they understand the things that we think are important, and then we in turn hear from them in terms of their level of importance. I know for many of you, and I understand at this moment, there's a lot of discussion around blue and red states. Lawyers, we don't really have that luxury in a state like the city of Chicago. I have citizens. I have to make sure at the end of the day, my decisions touch a person. When I was building commissioner and over infrastructure for the city, I knew the safety imperatives of everybody that went in a building and came out of a building, that I informed that. I took that same mindset into this role. I cannot focus on your politics. I don't necessarily know what they are. I can focus on the law and make sure that you have every opportunity to exist consistent with the Constitution that underpins this great nation, my great city, your great cities.
Wow. We could go for an hour, but they're not going to let us do that. I have one final question for both of you. What should every city official in this room be doing right now as they think about what steps they can take to protect the federal funding that is so important to the work we do as cities? What can they do to protect that funding and mitigate against some of the risk and the uncertainty that we know is out there?
I'll be brief and just say, get your city attorney involved as early as possible in these conversations at the table that Mary was talking about there.
Have me at the table. I'm just kidding. No, it's really important because there are languages that are changing in small ways. Sometimes there'll be modifications of a single sentence. That single sentence can make the difference in a False Claims Act attaching to you or not. I know it's not always pleasant to have a lawyer in the room that says no, but I'm a lawyer that says no, but. Tell me what you're trying to achieve and I'll tell you how to get there. So put someone in the room that will help you to navigate as leaders so that you can do what you do better than most, and that is serve the public.
Let's give them both a big round of applause. Mary and Amanda, thank you both for sharing your wisdom, your insights with all of us today. I've learned a lot. There's more certainly to learn, but it was a great start. Have a great conference, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.